Thanks for inviting me. I took a similar tack to what Stefan did, which is really focus on the years of my personal experience, especially the first few years. So I wasn't sure where to start, and I actually went back even further than Stefan, back to 1985 when I was still a student, and that was back when a very young Steve Jobs introduced the Apple Macintosh and laser writer. And standing next to him are Chuck Geschke and John Warnock, who were the co-founders of Adobe. Now, at Adobe, we thought about this as the introduction of Postscript. And in fact, Steve wanted to demo the laser writer on stage, so there weren't any applications that really took advantage of Postscript. So what John Warnock did was crafted by hand in Postscript a US tax form. Of course, the problem was a demo of a printer is not that exciting for most people. And this was now even worse because it took a couple of minutes to print. But John, as a computer scientist, he thought about it. He created basically an optimizing compiler written in Postscript that converted Postscript to faster Postscript. And that was really where the notion of the whole, what became called Distillery then, but called Acrobat Distiller, came from back in '85. So you go advance a few years, and what Adobe saw was that it was great to have this good imaging model in a printer, but you really needed the same imaging model on the computer as well as in the printer. And so they started working on something called Display Postscript. Now the problem was Postscript was sort of ahead of what computers could really do that. And so instead of focusing on Macs and PCs, which were underpowered for Postscript, they looked at Unix workstations. And by this point, Steve Jobs had left Apple, and he had started Next Computer. So Next and Adobe started working together, and Display Postscript was inside Next, and this is actually a screenshot from those days. Now, unfortunately, the truth was, those computers were still underpowered, so Postscript was a little too far out in that sense, and it wasn't really the success that any of us wanted. But meanwhile, something else was going on, which was Apple and Microsoft, saw the same issue. And so they came at it from the other way. And they also wanted more control over the technology. So they worked together. Apple built something then called Royal, now called TrueType. And then Microsoft helped too. They actually bought a Postscript clone. That was their contribution to the technology. And they initiated what we called then the font wars. And this was actually at a different Siebold conference where Bill Gates had just described, and that's young Bill Gates in the center there, had just described the new technology. Steve Jobs was not directly involved. He was just kind of looking over everything. And you can see John Warnock in that picture looking a little shell-shocked by all this. And then either just before or just after this picture was taken, one of my favorite quotes of all time in a public setting was, this was his assessment of the new technology, the biggest bunch of garbage and mumbo jumbo I've ever heard. So John came back to Adobe, and we came up with a more constructive response. And it was sort of a classic case of where this was a crisis for Adobe. Apple was our biggest customer. I'd been working there at Adobe for about a year at the time, was really worried about the future of Adobe, what was going to happen. And there were really three parts to our response. One was that Postscript had been public since its introduction, but it wasn't fully, right? The font format was not public until then. And so Adobe worked with the font vendors and agreed to make it public, and for them that meant publishing a book. At the same time, we started working on software, what was called Adobe Type Manager. And so for the first time on Mac and Windows, users could have the same fonts, the same scalable type on their screen as they could when they printed. And we got this started long after TrueType was in development, but got this out sooner than either Apple or Microsoft got their TrueType technology out. And then the last piece of it was incorporated into applications. So you would get basic integration for all applications with the Type Manager, but you could actually take advantage of APIs inside Type Manager to do even more. And so Illustrator was the first app to fully take advantage of scalable type on the Mac, and that was actually what I was working on during all of this. And then people started seeing, oh, now I have most of what I can do in Postscript, except for it's now working on Mac and Windows, and it's actually performant, which was something that, even though display Postscript was more powerful, it just wasn't fast enough. But what we didn't see that John saw was really the potential for this. This is when he wrote this white paper called the Camelot Project, and some of you may have seen it. It's on Adobe's website still. If you're interested, I encourage you to read it. I reread it for this presentation, and what struck me was he really captured the notion of what is PDF today. You know, back then, 28 years, a long time ago. And you know, so this whole notion of taking documents from any application, sending them to other computers, and being able to view and to print them. And you know, he didn't minimize what he thought this was. He really saw it, and where, to be honest, really nobody at that time at Adobe, you know, it was John, you know, he talks big, you know, but he really nailed it, which was that it would fundamentally change the way people work. So take a step back. What else was going on at that time? And that same year, 1990, was when Tim Berners-Lee was working on the ideas behind the World Wide Web, HTML and HTTP, and the end of that year, he actually released a first version of the World Wide Web, and ironically, on a Next computer that ran display Postscript. And at that point, it was just more of a research thing. Most people hadn't heard of it yet. So going into 91, a lot of people at Adobe, including me, were working on various aspects of this idea. I had sort of come from Illustrator, just finished shipping that, and it was at the time, you know, it was a pretty cool, if file formats can be cool, it was a pretty cool file format in the sense that you could take it and you could send it to any Postscript printer, but it also had all the information you needed to be able to edit. And so the idea was, could we extend that as sort of a universal editing format? And on a project I was working on, we worked with Digital Equipment Corporation and some other people to try to make this more universal. But there were a lot of other people at Adobe working on related ideas. It was a big deal, right? And we had this whole list of features, requirements, basically more than anybody can do, but we were just exploring. And it was that year, that was the Siebold conference that Stefan talked about, that John was sort of basically evangelizing this idea. But at the end of that year, we kind of realized we kind of had to get our act together. So, you know, it's sort of a typical startup kind of thing where you have a good idea, you kind of explore it, but at some point you say, you know, we have to ship this thing, and what are we going to ship? And that's where we sort of focused in on the view and print idea. And so we kind of said, editing and sort of more general interchange, we'll get to that in version 2, 1994 maybe, something like that. And so we put that aside. We also said, okay, we really need a team focused on this, just one team. So that's when Adobe chose Bob Wolf, who actually spoke here a few years ago as the manager of the project. And he put together a team from inside and outside Adobe, including me. And we also had a real schedule. You know, so we said we're going to ship at October 1992. So we were all set. And actually, I will note, this is actually from the same white paper that Stefan chose. I just happened to choose a different picture. So there was one small detail. We didn't have a file format yet. So when John first came up with the idea, and the first quick demo was actually just bitmaps, and then the team moved to Illustrator pages, because that could represent everything we needed to. But that didn't really scale for what we needed, right? So it's one thing if you have a printer and you just print the pages in order. It's another thing if you're in a viewer and a user might go from page to page. And it was important for performance reasons that you could randomly access any page. So John recruited somebody from Adobe's Advanced Technology Group. And it turned out to be a small world. It was my first advisor when I was a student at Carnegie Mellon who was working on this. And so he started working on something called Document Management System. And at this point, I was part of the product team. And so we were trying to integrate it, but won't go into details, but it wasn't working out so well. So April 1992, just a few months before we were going to ship, there were these two guys. One with less hair is me. The other one is Alan Wooten. And I walked into Alan's office and said, this isn't working. We're supposed to ship in 6 months, but I don't think we can do it the way we're going. I think we need to redo things. And Alan kind of went like this. He was like laid out in this chair. And before we actually came up with a plan or anything, Bob came by. He saw something was up, and he asked us what was going on. And we talked through the issues. And really, to Bob's credit, he didn't say, you're crazy, get back to work. He didn't say, oh, we need a steering committee to figure out what to do next, right? Fortunately, Adobe was small enough we didn't do that then. But he told Alan and me to get out of the office, go figure out what we needed to do. Take as much time as we want, as long as we come back in 2 days. So we were hoping for a little longer, but we took what we could get. So we packed up our computers. Of course, nobody had laptops then, and we carried them over to my house and set up in my dining room. And so basically, in a day, we really came up with what became sort of the final version of what became PDF. And what we did was, I took this picture. It was actually a picture I had drawn many years ago, which ended up in the reference manual, and said, okay, what do we really need, right? So we sort of took the Postscript imaging model and the fact that we were sort of going away from the full programming language to a declarative language as a given. And most of it was trying to make this workflow work, right? So the thing here is that we would take applications on the Mac or Windows and use the print stream to convert to PDF. And the issue was computers were small, all the applications basically filled up the computer, and there wasn't a lot of room for the actual print driver, which was this what we call PDF writer to convert from the print stream to PDF. And so they had to be single pass, they couldn't write to temporary files, there were a lot of restrictions. So we had to do that, we had to create the PDF in one pass, but then when it got to the viewer, it had to be randomly accessible. So that was sort of the key problem we were trying to solve. And then the other piece of it was that even then Acrobat did a little bit of editing. We're not ambitious about that, but even to be able to insert or delete pages, what we needed was that if you made a change, time had to be proportional to the extent of the change. If you delete a page, you couldn't be rummaging through, say, a 200-page document looking for all the references to that page. And so that's basically where the PDF1 ideas came from. So we were in pretty good shape at that point. And in fact, Adobe went ahead with some of the marketing for the fall. And we actually, scarily enough, won Best of Show at Comdex, which was the big computer conference at the time. And that, you can imagine, that added a little pressure to us. We still hadn't shipped yet. In April of '93, the first web browser that really incorporated sort of the modern web browser, incorporated both text and images came out. Now, I didn't actually look at it then. I still remember a friend from Xerox PARC saying, you should check out this Mosaic thing. It's kind of cool, and somehow it overlaps with what you're doing. And I said, I wish I had time, but we're trying to ship this thing. I'll look at it when we're done. I don't think most people at Adobe had really looked at it at that time. And part of what was keeping me busy, especially I remember that April, was that we had a lot of requirements like I showed you for what was then called interchange Postscript. One of them was a public spec. That was always important from the beginning. And so we had decided we were going to publish a book, just like the PDF book that was called the Red Book, and the font book. There'd be one just for PDF. And it was mostly me who had written the initial internal spec, and then started writing what became the book, and Tim Binns, who was in developer support. And so we were busy doing that, and we finished. But then the editor of the book said, it's too short. There's not enough pages here for a book. So then Tim had to go back, and he wrote some examples and how to make your PDFs better so that we had enough pages to actually have the book. So if you ever wondered why those early editions of the book had all that extra stuff, that was why. Eventually they solved that problem by adding enough features to the language that it was big enough on its own. But that wasn't the case in the beginning. So June hit, and we actually made our deadline and shipped our book. And then 2 weeks later, it was the bigger deal, which was that we actually shipped Acrobat. In case you're wondering, we shipped at 10:09 a.m. I'm not sure why we needed to record that for posterity, but we did. And so then, there was a lot of hype at that time. So we were front page news for the Mercury News and the San Francisco Chronicle. This was harder to do then. Tech wasn't really as integrated into the world as it is now, and my mother had no idea what I was doing, so at least I could show her this. And then Adobe went along with the hype. It was a little crazy for them then, but they put an 8-page insert into the Wall Street Journal. But that was when we sort of noticed, maybe we have a little problem. I was, of course, on vacation. We had just shipped, and so I was outside the Silicon Valley bubble at that time. And I would show people this, isn't this great? Whether it was the ad or whether it was the actual application. And they would kind of look at me and say, what is this? I don't understand. So I think that's when we realized it would be more of a long haul than a quick overnight success. But we continued. Part of the promise was all platforms, which included DOS at that point. And so this was one of the big unsung technical achievements, was getting anything to work on DOS. Almost all the applications were just plain text, plain ASCII, and to get the full reader in there in less than a megabyte was pretty amazing. Adobe marketing had no idea what to do with this, so they literally put it in a brown paper box. That's how they shipped it. They couldn't afford color for DOS. So at the end of the year, we shipped a few more versions. We now ran on 7 different flavors of Unix and OS/2. I think in the desktop world there was a lot more heterogeneity then. We kind of dipped our toe into the web with having links out from PDF. But really the most important feature in this second release of Acrobat and PDF was not a feature at all, was a change in the business model. Up until this point, Reader was $50 a copy, which most people didn't want to pay. And publishers weren't interested in using the format if there weren't readers. There wasn't really a way for them to provide readers, even if we discounted it. And so we sort of switched around and said, we're just going to make the reader free. And this was a really hard thing for Adobe to do. I mean, there were a lot of people inside Adobe then who really didn't believe in Acrobat and PDF and said, we can't give this stuff away. This is really our core technology, right? I mean, all the technology that Adobe had done for over 10 years was really inside Reader. And the stuff inside Acrobat was a lot easier to do and figure out. But the core imaging, and including the Adobe Type Manager, were all necessary for Reader, and now we're all free. But that was really a key turning point. It wasn't enough to really make it successful, but that was a big change. Now, again, what else is going on? So Netscape had formed earlier that year. Jim Clark and Mark Andreessen started it, and they also had a similar business model where at first their browser was not free either. It was like $20, but then they went to a free browser, and really the whole internet hype had begun. And so we saw that it was helping PDF. We used to come in every morning and talk about, oh, here's a new PDF we found on the web. I mean, literally individual PDFs. Say, oh, this one's exciting. But the salespeople and the marketing people got involved. And a big change was when we started talking to the U.S. the IRS about their tax forms. Ironically, here's the same tax form that John Warnock had handcrafted 10 years ago, and now the IRS was publishing it on their website. So it was a huge deal for them because they used to mail out literally 100 million forms every year. And the US tax system is very complicated. There's lots of forms, there's lots of publications. So this was a huge deal for them. So they started using PDF on their website. But of course, who knew PDF then? So they also published Postscript, right? And in fact, that's why it was easy for them to switch to PDF, because they had Postscript. But they also provided PCL, which is HP's printer control language, because who knows if people will use PDF. And just to cover all their bases, they also printed or published their tax forms in SGML. Now, I saw that in what I read. I'm not even sure how they did that. I have an idea, but it tells you what a different world it was. So meanwhile, we started working with Netscape. And then at the end of '96, we came out with a release of Acrobat, and Netscape came out with a new release that basically created this kind of Rube Goldberg thing that integrated Acrobat and the Netscape browser, and that's when they provided their API. But there was actually a lot more, not just at the browser. As complicated as that was, there was a lot more below it. When Alan and I sat in my dining room sort of figuring this out, we didn't know about the web, and we were assuming that we would have a hard disk, something that was actually randomly accessible, unlike the web. And so now we had to think about how to sort of retrofit this world. So what the team did, it was a couple of things. One was there was actually a new revision of the web serving protocol, HTTP, this was 1.1, which let you access random sets of bytes. And this was something PDF needed. But that wasn't going to be good enough because of latency. That was not going to provide good performance in the general case. So what we also did was linearize, or what we call linearized PDF, making sure everything necessary to show that first page was up front. So you would just start serving the PDF, and the first page could come up as quickly as it could. And I like this screenshot because it just shows what a different world it was. This was New York Times being ahead of the curve in what they're publishing, and this is what they did then. Now, that release of Acrobat and PDF actually included a lot of other stuff too, and that was our first, but not our last attempt at forms. That was also where the first pre-press features got in. We had to be kind of ruthless about what went into the first version of Acrobat and PDF just to ship it. But as Stefan was talking about, the publishing industry said, this seems like a pretty good idea. This solves a lot of problems that we really need solved. Identification of resources, some other things. But it just doesn't have enough features. It's missing the features that we really need. And as Stefan mentioned, it took several iterations, several versions to really get all the features necessary. And this is where we started trying to make Postscript and PDF really give them feature equality. We also left out anything but Roman fonts. So there were no Asian fonts. This was, again, we had a little more resources, both in terms of programmers and in terms of what's on the computer. So we started supporting Asian fonts, and we shipped Japanese fonts at this point. And then the last thing I mentioned, it's not really a user visible feature, but sort of the exception that sort of emphasizes the rule we had. I described for the web, we were very careful to change the format in a way that the old viewers still worked with the new files. So they didn't take advantage of this linearization, but they did work as they always did. But for intellectual property reasons, we had to replace the old page compression, which was LZW, with something that anybody could use, which was Flate. And so that was the one case where we really had to be incompatible in a major way with what went before. Yeah. You may be wondering how I'm going to cover 25 years at the pace I'm going, but I'm putting the next 20 years all in one slide. So in '96 was also when my wife and I, our first child was born. I took paternity leave and thought about what I was doing and decided to try something new. So that's sort of the end of where I was intimately involved with everything PDF and Acrobat. So obviously there's a lot of history after that, and there's some stories I could tell about that, but I really wanted to focus on those first few years. One thing I did want to mention was about the name. All right, so where did portable document format come from? Right, it doesn't. You saw early on, both in things that I showed and also Stefan, that there's this notion of interchange Postscript. There's no Postscript in this name, right? There's no Adobe in this name, and there's no Acrobat in this name, and that was all intentional, right? We wanted something generic that wasn't totally, even from the beginning, that wasn't totally tied to our product. And in fact, we didn't even want to, we didn't want to have a license to create or read PDF. We didn't even put a trademark on the name, and that was intentional. So we didn't want to put Adobe or Postscript in there because that was trademarked. Now, even that was controversial inside Adobe, both at the beginning and then over the years, and that's why, at some point, we Adobe, the company, started talking about Adobe PDF. It was like, oh, well, we need to, some people say, oh, that was a mistake. We need to start putting these together. So there's always that, it's a big company, and there's always that tension about exactly what strategy. But that's what started from the beginning. So to wrap up, I was thinking about, well, two things. What made PDF successful in the first place, and why has it been as successful as it has been? And in terms of the original success, I think, it's for most products, right? There's sort of this combination of features and quality, right? We kind of tried to skimp on the features as much as possible, but we said we really want to nail view and print. We really want to get that right. There were other products trying to do the same thing. John Warnock had done such a good job at evangelizing this, and we had taken long enough to get this first one out that we had competition before we shipped, right? And I think the difference was, our quality tended to be better. It wasn't perfect. There were bugs for a long time. There still are, as all of you know. But I think we got that right. Another thing was performance, right? We weren't as fast as some of the early competitors, but we were a lot faster than Display Postscript, and that made all the difference. A third thing was the strategy of the print stream, right? So we didn't have this chicken and egg problem of trying to get enough applications to start generating PDF. That we more or less worked with all these desktop applications out of the box, and that was a big deal. We still had the chicken and egg problem with the reader, but we didn't have it with creation. But that last missing piece was distribution, and we didn't really figure that out on our own. It's that was sort of right place, right time. That came into place, over the first few years of our release, and then there were, several non-technical reasons as well for PDF's and Acrobat's success. One was the public specification, as I mentioned. Another was this change in the business model to the free reader. And part of it was the Adobe brand even then, especially compared to some of the smaller competitors at the beginning. And the last was really John Warnock. John Warnock and Chuck Geschke really fought for Acrobat inside Adobe, right? I mean, it was, say, 5 years before it really took off. And there were a lot of people who said this is just a drain and we should just get rid of it and really focus on Postscript, and they really stuck with it. John was obviously more of the public face outside Adobe, really evangelizing it, but it made a tremendous difference. In terms of why we're here today, I mean, one is the whole thing with the web, but also from Acrobat and PDF itself, is this, in '93 people were talking, not just Adobe was talking about the paperless office, but it really didn't, people have been talking about it for years before that, but it finally happened, right? And so, PDF was both contributed, but also on the ride of this whole shift. And then part of it is, well, why PDF and why not HTML, is really that it's this format it's a reliable format for exchanging documents, for archiving documents. You know, another thing that obviously happened is the ISO standards. I think the tech industry 25 years ago was different. It's much more mature now, and I think the rest of the world has much higher expectations. So we could say it's public, and that was good enough even for the IRS, but you know, it's not good enough today. And having a real standard makes a big difference. And then hand in hand with that is you guys, is the community, right? Is that if you have a standard that's really just one company, it doesn't really work. It's not really a standard. And so having a community really validates that, and then also, of course, contributes to the technology itself, right? That it's more robust with a bigger group of people with lots of different perspectives coming in. So I was going to wrap up with sort of the future, but you have to stay tuned. Tomorrow there's a panel at the end of the day where we'll talk more about that. So that's all I had. If anybody has questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Richard, for the very interesting presentations. Questions here? Who's brave enough? Okay, I have one. What's your personal projects today? What are you working on? It's PDF related, I guess.
Yeah. So, yeah, I left Adobe for a few years, and then I came back to work on something that we called PDF 2.0 that never saw the light of day, and that's a whole nother story in itself. And what I've been working on for the past couple of years is actually extracting the structure of a PDF when that structure is not embedded, right? And obviously you can have tagged PDF, and you know the quality of that may be good or bad, but at least it's there. And the idea here is that if a PDF is generated without structure, can we use machine learning to figure out what's there? You know, Adobe has had built into Acrobat and something we call Make Accessible to do that, but it's we haven't looked at it in new terms, and so if anybody's interested, I can say more about that later. And there's actually we published a paper in one of the AI conferences about it. I can reference as well.
Thank you. Oh, in the back. Try it without the micro, please.
Okay, I will try without the microphone. Hi.
Hi.
I made this question a couple months ago, and I will make this question again. What is the future of development of PDF reader in mobile devices? Because I am a representative of the print industry. I'm struggling with the problems regarding the representation of the print files. So let's say the overprints in a PDF reader on a mobile device. And actually right now it's a nightmare. It's better to send the user the JPEGs than the PDF to the device. So is there any upgrades on that in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually something that would have been, well, something I'll mention tomorrow as well. I think mobile is a huge issue, right? That today, when we did this, any computer meant Mac, PC, Unix, right? Nowadays, I mean, I think this environment, right, you all are not typical because most of you have a computer and one of them are mobile devices, but for a lot of the world, all they have is their phone, right? And so it's becoming more and more important. And I think it's something that we need to address. Adobe is working on it, and so one of the reasons, for extracting structure, right? There's a lot of things you can do when you extract structure out of a document, right? The original, it turns out I had thought the original goal of all that was accessibility, but I talked to the person who started it, and it wasn't. The first time that they started working on that was to support mobile devices, and at that point a mobile device was a Palm Pilot, right, which had an even smaller screen than anything you have today. And so I think getting more structure into documents is really the solution there. And the question is how to really go about it.
Okay, I'd like to add on a little bit. So on the one hand, yes, the standards and also the PDF Association has initiatives to get PDF better on mobile devices. We also have presentations over the days. I can immediately think of Matthew Hardy. And then it also was a little bit a product question, so I have to say there are multiple vendors. So if it depends on the product, then it's multiple vendors and members which are here. And I forgot in the morning we have this mobile corner. So people which are especially interested, there is the idea to meet there. Other questions? Okay, one more for me.
Okay.
I've seen Netscape, I had to remember. Yes, I used it, I was excited. So you mentioned the reasons why we did survive 25 years, let's call it survive. Have you seen any competitors, serious competitors those years? I remember there was an EPUB wave. What was your view? Was there ever
Yeah, I mean, it's
a format, from the format point?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, ironically, Adobe had helped create some of these competing formats as well. In fact, I worked on SVG, and so that, in one sense, it provided roughly the same imaging model as in PDF, right? There's EPUB, there's all the mobile, sort of the ebook formats, and I think, to be honest, my guess is not any better than any of yours, but what I'll say is just that, if you have a PDF, you know that, okay, I know what I can do with it, and the other ones have not had enough critical mass. Kindle, I don't know the actual numbers, right? There's a huge number of Kindles, but that's more of a closed environment, right? And then the other ones are more fragmented.
Thank you. Other questions? Harald. You always have a question, Tim.
You were mentioning SVG. I was wondering, the first SVG supporting functions in Microsoft was from Adobe. And I thought Adobe did a great job on that. That's a couple of weeks ago. Did you actively opt out of that at a certain time and said we're not feeding our competitor anymore?
Well, the irony is, literally this morning, I started up PowerPoint on my Mac, and it said, "What's new in PowerPoint?" And it said, "Now with support for SVG, including editing." So, what happened with Adobe? It was a big, this is sort of inside baseball kind of thing, but I'll just say it. And 200 of my closest friends. Is that when we were working on that in the late 90s. And, at that point, Adobe, well, it's a standards committee. That means we don't have control. There was a lot of back and forth, and it was kind of not fully, we went for it, but we weren't fully committed. And, and then when Adobe bought Macromedia, right? I mean, Flash was really the big competitor to SVG, right? I mean, there was all these politics with that from early on. And so at that point, Adobe's interest in SVG really kind of dissipated. So there really we still support it, right? But, in terms of really having advocates inside Adobe, it's, not so much, and that's been, over 10 years.
Where do you see the future of PDF going in terms of adoption rate? Because to give an example, usually like 20 or something years ago, you needed physical documents. Then we moved to electronic documents, and now even my local cinema theater no longer requires this. I can give them a PDF with a barcode, but I can also simply write it down and enter the number at their kiosk, and it will accept that as a valid token. Right. And similarly, in order to board an airplane, I just need a QR code. I don't need the actual document anymore.
Right.
So how do you see this evolution?
That's also on the slide I didn't put up. And I think that was the first item. The second item was mobile. I mean, as for the first item, I think it's a real issue, right? And I think something like the boarding pass is a good example where, you know, what it's replaced with is not a facsimile of a piece of paper, right? It's just, you know, the information, right? And so in those cases, it's not so important. But I think there's still a lot of cases where that's also a transaction, right? There are a lot of other cases where what you need is essentially an archive of what happened. So I think there will be a lot of cases where its useful kind of dissipate. But as more and more, you know, what we need is to preserve a record of a transaction, and that's really where this sort of traditional use of PDF will stay and actually grow in a sense, right? That, you know, if it was all paper, you didn't need PDF, right? If it's both, okay, you have both. When you don't have paper, you need some kind of paper equivalent essentially for the record, and I think that will actually grow, not shrink.
Yeah, thank you. So this discussion can take 2 days. I was always looking for the paper, so paper does not really decrease. So I don't know. 10 years ago we would say today we are paper free. We're not really yet.